Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. It's nice to see you all. I'd like to begin by thanking all the organizers, especially Ermin Sinanovic. Thank you for that generous introduction. It's an honor to be here. The late Ismail Al-Faruqi and the late Lois Lamia Al-Faruqi left indelible marks on their respective fields. Their contributions were numerous, and their tragic murder is a stark reminder that we live in a turbulent world. May they rest in peace, rahimahumullah. In the midst of a lively televised exchange between journalist Fareed Zakaria, as is pronounced on CNN, and neuroscientist Sam Harris on the topic of jihad, Zakaria declared, "The problem is, you and Osama bin Laden agree. After all, you're saying his interpretation of Islam is correct." "Well," Harris responded, "his interpretation, this is the problem. His interpretation of Islam is very straightforward and honest, and you really have to split hairs and do some interpretive acrobatics in order to get it to look non-canonical." This exchange took place a little more than 13 years after the September 11, 2001 attacks. In the years following the 9/11 tragedy, various individuals known as New Atheists have produced influential anti-theistic and anti-religious works. Much of the focus of these works has been on Islam. In the case of the prominent ex-Muslim writer Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for instance, her doubts about Islam were supplanted by non-belief when she found it impossible to discount bin Laden's claims that the murderous destruction of innocent lives is consistent with the Quran. As for Harris, he reportedly began writing his landmark book, The End of Faith, on September 12, 2001. In this New York Times bestseller, Harris writes that the feature of Islam most troubling to non-Muslims is the very principle bin Laden invoked to justify 9/11, jihad. And as the English evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins would have it, it was belief in the literal truth of the Quran that led 19 well-educated middle-class men to kill thousands of people in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. Tonight's presentation, I intend to scrutinize some especially influential New Atheist claims regarding violence in Islam. Now, some might ask, why talk about the New Atheists in the age of Trump? Some might ask, why talk about them at all? Isn't this giving them undue attention? I've chosen to focus on the New Atheists largely because of their unique and ostensibly significant influence on popular intellectual discourse. Having taught in the humanities at 2 public research universities in the American Midwest, I have found that many professors and students have been more profoundly impacted by the writings of New Atheists than, say, polemical works by far-right religiously affiliated critics of Islam, whose impact is more obvious in other contexts. Notwithstanding their numerous detractors, what the New Atheists say about jihad and Islam more broadly has had ramifications within academia, to say nothing of the political and cultural spheres. As such, I don't think it makes much sense to ignore them. I examined the writings of various New Atheists in my most recent book, Jihad, Radicalism, and the New Atheism, shameless plug. In this book, I look at various New Atheist claims regarding the Quran, the Prophet, Islamic law, jihad, Muslim terrorism, and polling data. All in all, this was a dark project, quite unlike my first book on salvation and divine mercy. I have images of working on this book at 2 in the morning, my family's upstairs sleeping, I'm by myself looking at ISIS documents, and Sam Harris. It was a very depressing project. Now, it was not my intention to offer an exhaustive analysis of jihad, violent radicalism, or the New Atheism. Rather, I was interested in the intersection of the three. This evening, I'd like to focus on the popular New Atheist claim that Muslim terrorism can be best explained by Islamic scripture. And of course, this claim is not unique to the New Atheists. And in the brief time I have, I'd like to pay special attention to the ever-influential writings of Sam Harris. Though critical of all monotheistic traditions, Harris has much to say about what he calls the problem with Islam, the title of one of the chapters of the end of faith. Indeed, from the very beginning of this book, Harris casts a light on this particular problem. Harris opens the book in dramatic fashion, depicting a scene in which a suicide bomber detonates himself in a crowded bus. Harris tells us that the bomber's parents are sad when they hear the news, but they also feel tremendous pride because they know that he has gone to heaven and has sent his victims to hell for eternity. It is a double victory. Assuming we know nothing else about the bomber, such as his past, economic status, intelligence, educational background, or profession, Harris rhetorically asks, why is this so easy? So trivially easy. You could almost bet your life on it easy to guess the young man's religion. Harris's point here is clear. Religious beliefs, in this case Islamic ones, can be dangerous, and I'll say more about this point later. Inspired as he was by 9/11, to compose The End of Faith, Harris devotes much of his attention to Muslim suicide terrorism. As he presents it, it is Islamic ideology, and not as political scientist Robert Pape maintains, specific nationalist goals, that best explains this phenomenon. After all, Muslim terrorists define themselves in religious terms. Of course, the same is true for many of their Muslim opponents, a much larger group. For Harris, however, the exception often proves the rule. And in his efforts to cast Islamic doctrines of jihad and martyrdom as sufficient explanations for Muslim terrorism, he highlights the case of a Palestinian man named Zaidan. Harris writes, one failed Palestinian suicide bomber described being pushed to attack Israelis by the love of martyrdom. He, Zaidan, added, I didn't want revenge for anything. I just wanted to be a martyr. Mr. Zaidan, the would-be martyr, conceded that his Jewish captors were better than many, many Arabs. With regard to the suffering that his death would have inflicted upon his family, he reminded his interviewer that a martyr gets to pick 70 people to join him in paradise. He would have been sure to invite his family along. So, he just wanted to be a martyr. That Harris thought Zaidan's story was revealing and representative of a broader phenomenon of faith leading directly to destruction is suggested by the fact that this quoted passage appears in the introductory chapter of The End of Faith. Harris does not tell us anything else about Zaidan, but there is in fact more to his story. When discussing and quoting Zaidan, Harris cites a June 8, 2002 New York Times article, so naturally I took a look at it. A close reading reveals another side to the would-be suicide bomber. To quote the article, Zaidan, a 5th grade dropout who can read but not write, became a carpenter, then a peddler of newspapers and other products in Israel. When the latest conflict began in September 2000, he said he sought work fruitlessly in Jenin, settling for a couple of hours spent each day carrying boxes of vegetables in the market there. The rest of the day, he spent sleeping or hanging around a pool hall, smoking. Then he happened to watch a religious lesson on television that convinced him he was wasting his time. In what he called his life's turning point, he quit billiards and began going to the mosque regularly. Eventually, he stopped smoking. He insisted that he was drawn to martyrdom by what he read in books, not by anything he heard from his imam. It continues. After Israel first raided Jenin's refugee camp at the beginning of March, Mr. Zaidan said he began to think seriously about becoming a suicide bomber. With regard to his planned attack, he insisted that he had sought to kill only soldiers whom he described as overwhelming adversaries. The author of this article, James Bennett, informs us that his 2+ hour conversation with Zaidan, then 18 years old, took place in an Israeli hospital shortly after the failed attack, while Zaidan was expecting to be prosecuted. Guarded by 2 Israeli police officers and manacled by a wrist and an ankle to his bed, he said bitterly that he knew he would be jailed for life and remembered only as a terrorist. I feel sorry because it was a mistake, he said, but as a human being, I should live like others. The way there is an Israeli state, there are people living in this state, enjoying life. having someone protect them. I don't live in this situation. I don't feel I'm secure. Soldiers could enter Jenin at any time, he said, and he constantly feared being arrested. As long as life continues like this, he said, you will have people who think like me. He insisted that he wanted peace, but said he saw little chance for it. Now, assuming Zayden genuinely sought martyrdom, it is difficult to overlook the obvious political dimensions of his actions, his limited education, and the circumstances of his conversation with Bennett, the author of the article, with Israeli police officers nearby and a trial looming. Incidentally, Bennett himself calls into question Zayden's trustworthiness. Zayden, he writes, insisted today that he had not detonated his bomb, but instead had been shot twice in the stomach by soldiers. That account was not supported by his wounds, according to the hospital. These are not just details. Remember, all Harris tells us about Zayden's motivation to attack Israelis is that he was driven by a love of martyrdom. Furthermore, Harris never conveys Zayden's criticisms of the Israeli army. Instead, Harris simply tells us that Zayden conceded that his Israeli captors were better than many, many Arabs. This is called cherry picking. And Harris does the same with other sources, including Islamic scripture. He cites various translated Quranic passages on warfare, without giving due consideration to their respective contexts, the surrounding passages, and other more precise translations. And here I think an effective antidote would be Professor Asma Afsaruddin's Striving in the Path of God. Here Professor Afsaruddin examines Quranic passages on jihad and warfare and presents the various ways that Muslim commentators have interpreted these passages. When talking about jihad, Harris's sources are limited, as he relies heavily on the late Bernard Lewis and his discussions of aggressive jihad. And I'll say more about Professor Lewis in just a moment. Muslim scholarly works on Islam are noticeably absent from Harris's bibliography. And this might explain the following passage from The End of Faith. Harris writes, surely there are Muslim jurists who might say that suicide bombing is contrary to the tenets of Islam. Where are these jurists, by the way? By the way, he's writing in 2004. Where are these jurists, by the way? And that suicide bombers are therefore not martyrs, but fresh denizens of hell. Such a minority opinion, if it exists, cannot change the fact that suicide bombings have been rationalized by much of the Muslim world. Of course, the reality is that when Harris was writing this, multitudes, not all of course, but multitudes of prominent clerics and scholars had publicly and explicitly condemned suicide missions and terrorism more broadly. At one point, Harris remarks, one can only marvel that suicide bombing is not more widespread. With his focus firmly on Muslim terrorism, Harris neglects the broader Islamic landscape. He was apparently unaware, for instance, that suicide attacks of any kind were historically uncommon in the Sunni tradition claimed by Sunni terrorists. And of course, it's also uncommon in 12-verse Shia thought and so on. 12-verse Shia history, excuse me. Interestingly, the very authority Harris relies on when discussing jihad, Professor Bernard Lewis, who was hardly an apologist for Islam, had this to say in a 2009 co-authored work. The emergence of the by now widespread terrorism practice of suicide bombing is a development of the 20th century. It has no antecedents in Islamic history and no justification in terms of Islamic theology, law, or tradition. It is a pity that those who practice this form of terrorism are not better acquainted with their own religion and with the culture that grew up under the auspices of that religion. Recall that Harris opens The End of Faith by depicting a suicide bomber and then asking the reader, why is it so easy to guess his religion? You know, if I could go back in time and take a copy of The End of Faith and go back to the 70s, and even meet a young Sam Harris and show him this passage, it's likely that he wouldn't be able to guess. Because there was no such thing as a Muslim suicide bomber until the early 1980s. And even after then, there was not one case of suicide bombing in a conflict as intense as the Soviet-Afghan War, which, by the way, involved the so-called Mujahideen and foreign fighters like a man named Osama bin Laden. Nevertheless, as Harris would have it, Muslims have not found anything of substance to say against suicide terrorism, including the actions of the September 11 hijackers. This, of course, is an unfortunate myth. The reality is that the targeting of innocents was a recurring theme in the September 2001 condemnations issued by countless scholars and clerics. But not only does Harris seem aloof to the major currents of Islamic thought, he also fails to maintain a consistent line of reasoning. Twice, in The End of Faith, Harris contrasts Islam with the pacifist Jain religion. First, he states that there is a reason we must now confront Muslim rather than Jain terrorists in every corner of the world. For Harris, the reason is simply the nature of Islam. Now, to place this statement in perspective, the entire Jain population amounts to no more than 0.5% of the worldwide Muslim population and is mostly concentrated in India. Second, Harris asserts that in contrast with Islamic fundamentalism, a rise of Jain fundamentalism would endanger no one, because observant Jains generally will not kill anything, including insects. So yay for pacifism, right? And yet, just a few pages earlier, and in the context of defending the use of military technology, Harris describes pacifism as, quote, a deeply immoral position that comes to us swaddled in the dogma of highest moralism. It allows a variety of monsters currently loose in the world to threaten the rest of us. Then, shortly after defending the limited use of torture when dealing with terrorists, he elaborates on the false choice of pacifism and explains why we must accept the fact that violence or its threat is often an ethical necessity. But let's get back to Harris's main argument. As he sees it, what makes Muslim extremists extreme is their devotion to the literal word of the Quran and the Hadith. Violent radicals, we are led to believe, are monsters precisely because of their close adherence to the letter of Scripture. This is a point Harris makes in various writings, including The End of Faith and his 2015 co-authored book, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Richard Dawkins make similar claims in their respective works. In her popular 2015 book, Heretic, Ali remarks that since 9/11, she has been making a simple argument in response to Muslim terrorism. It is foolish to insist, as our leaders habitually do, that the violent acts of radical Islamists can be divorced from the religious ideals that inspire them. Thus, those who maintain that Muslim terrorism is actually a problem of poverty, insufficient education, or any other social precondition are offering, as she puts it, facile explanations. This is because Islamic violence is rooted in the foundational texts of Islam itself. Dawkins makes similar claims in his 2006 New York Times bestseller, The God Delusion. But in blaming Islam's foundational texts for contemporary terrorism, while downplaying other factors, Harris, Ali, and Dawkins present explanations that are just as facile as those of the apologists they criticize. In evaluating the claim that Muslim terrorism can be best explained by scriptural literalism, let us consider two cases. The first is the justifications for terrorism presented in a 2017 ISIS publication. The second is bin Laden's justifications for the killing of innocents on 9/11. Now, there's a lot to say about ISIS, but in the interest of time, I'd like to focus on a single article that appeared in the January 2017 issue of the online ISIS magazine, Rumiyya. The article, entitled Collateral Carnage, presents a justification for terrorism and the killing of innocents in general. According to this anonymous article, although Muslims may not exclusively target non-threatening, non-Muslim women and children who are neither under Muslim rule nor protected by a truce, such innocents may be generally attacked nonetheless if they are not distinctly isolated or easily distinguishable from enemy non-Muslim men. This, by the way, according to this particular article, all such men would be considered combatants. And this actually contradicts the May 2017 issue of Rumiyya, which notes that some categories of non-Muslim men are not to be treated as combatants. So we have an obvious contradiction within just a few months in the same publication. In any case, to justify the collateral killing of innocent women and children, the Rumiyya author points to two reported prophetic precedents. One is the Prophet permitting the use of mangonels, or catapults, which the author claims were common in siege warfare, even during the life of the Prophet. The anonymous author's assumption, which is not unique to him or her, is that the Prophet used a weapon of mass destruction that led to the deaths of innocents. A careful examination of the various authoritative hadith collections and biographies of the Prophet seems to undermine this assumption. Some biographies do not bother to mention the use of mangonels at all, others mention it in passing, and the detailed account we have paints a picture quite different from those seeking to legitimize massive collateral killings. In the detailed account we have, we read that the Prophet's Persian companion, Salman al-Farisi, who often conveniently appears to offer military advice, suggested the use of a mangonel to breach the walls of the fortress of the enemy Thaqif tribe. Accordingly, the Muslims constructed a mangonel, but they never actually put it to use, as the individuals who were attempting to operate it were killed when the forces of Thaqif attacked them with hot iron and arrows. The Muslim army subsequently continued to lay Ta'if without the use of mangonels, and the Thaqif eventually surrendered. Thus, according to this account, the Prophet only attempted to use a mangonel once in a brief, unsuccessful attempt to breach walls that were guarded by combatants. The Rumiyya author seems to be unaware of such details and thus paints a very different picture. One imagines the mangonels going over the walls and killing who's ever beyond. The author also controversially compares mangonels to most missiles and explosives of today, even though many scholars historically distinguished between attacking fortifications with mangonels and using fire. Another invoked precedent comes from a hadith recorded by Al-Bukhari and Muslim, in which the Prophet is queried as to whether it would be permissible to attack an enemy force at night when it's dark. And he responds in the affirmative, indicating that any non-combatants harmed collaterally are of the combatants. We can call this the "they are of them" hadith. By the way, some scholars hold that this hadith was abrogated, but this is clearly not the view of the Rumiyya author. In fact, the author asserts, the best practice when conducting raids is to start during the night, or at the break of dawn, before the sun rises, while the enemy is asleep, and no light shines, and an adult male is not easily distinguishable from women and children. Why is it best to attack in the dark while the enemy is sleeping? Well, the author points to the example of God. For the Quran states that God destroyed many towns at night or while people were sleeping in the afternoon. This represents a remarkable conflation of the human with the divine. As for the normative example of the Prophet, the Rumiyya author makes no reference to and demonstrates no awareness of the well-known hadith recorded by Al-Bukhari that states that whenever the Prophet reached a people by night, he never started an attack until it was morning. Various hadiths, including reports recorded by Al-Bukhari and Muslim, tell us that this is precisely what happened when the Prophet reached the Arabian city of Khaybar after nightfall. He did not enter the city until its inhabitants were awake. So we would expect the Rumiyya author to take these hadiths seriously because of where they appear, the collections of Al-Bukhari and Muslim. But again, the author seems oblivious to all this. In any case, the non-combatant killings that the Rumiyya author attempts to justify are far more intentional than what is suggested in the "they are of them" hadith, as commonly understood, as the author calls for the targeting of the so-called kafir masses using highly destructive technology and weaponry, including, again, the missiles and explosives of today. As such, the Rumiyya author can hardly be described as a strict literalist, especially when one considers that one of the most widely accepted hadiths states that it is impermissible to kill women and children. And of course, there are other reputedly authoritative hadiths that prohibit the killing of various categories of non-combatant men. As for bin Laden, I realize he's no longer alive and it's been some years since 9/11. And yet, as we saw earlier in the exchange between Fareed Zakaria and Sam Harris, the latter has fairly recently pointed to bin Laden as a model Muslim, and one whose interpretation is honest and straightforward. But consider some of the interpretive acrobatics bin Laden performed in his generally unsuccessful attempt to convince Muslim clerics and Islamists, including many who already held anti-American sentiments, that the killing of innocents on 9/11 could be justified. First, recognizing that he was neither a state authority nor a certified scholar of Islam, and seeking to enlist all Muslims in a war that would employ extreme tactics, bin Laden attempted to demonstrate that the manifestly aggressive attacks of 9/11 were in fact part of a defensive jihad. Second, in making the case for a defensive jihad, bin Laden went to great lengths to present the US as a bona fide threat to Muslims worldwide. He pointed to various American actions and sanctions while oversimplifying and misrepresenting some aspects of geopolitical reality. As bin Laden saw it, his war against the United States could be justified on the basis of reason. What is wrong, he asked, with resisting those who attack you? All religious communities have such a principle. For example, these Buddhists, both the North Koreans and Vietnamese who fought America. And with regard to the US presence in his Saudi homeland, he remarked, if God had not blessed us with Islam, then our ancestors in the pagan age would not have let these people come either. And third, recognizing the Prophet's explicit prohibition against the killing of innocents, most notably women and children, bin Laden argued that Al-Qaeda's tactics against the US were necessary and served the common good, notwithstanding indications to the contrary. And although the 9/11 attacks were directed mostly at civilians, many busy at work, he asserted that he was not targeting innocents, but rather the symbol of a threatening enemy, and that collateral casualties were therefore acceptable, an assertion widely regarded as disingenuous. For good measure, however, he also attempted to make an obviously modern argument that American adult civilians could be treated as combatants because both the taxes they paid, as required by law, and the decisions made by their government officials, who were neither unanimously elected nor unanimously supported, helped shape US foreign policy. And finally, notwithstanding his superficial claim that he was not targeting innocents, he endeavored to advance and defend an expansive conception of retaliation in order to justify the intentional killing of American non-combatants. And I'd like to spend some time on this last point. In October 2001, bin Laden was interviewed by the well-known Al Jazeera reporter Taysir Al-Louni, an interview that was not aired until January 2002. In this conversation, which is said to be the most revealing exchange with bin Laden on record, bin Laden responded to the claim that the 9/11 hijackers had killed innocents. He remarked, "It is very strange for Americans and other educated people to talk about the killing of innocent civilians. I mean, who said that our children and civilians are not innocents and that the shedding of their blood is permissible? Whenever we kill their civilians, the whole world yells at us from east to west, and America starts putting pressure on its allies and puppets. Who said that our blood isn't blood and that their blood is blood? What about the people that have been killed in our lands for decades?" He would go on to declare that his people kill the civilians among the disbelievers in response to their killing of the Muslims. Here the interviewer Al-Louni interjected, "So you say that this is an eye for an eye. They kill our innocents, so we kill theirs." Bin Laden replied, "Yes, so we kill their innocents. This is valid both religiously and logically. But some of the people who talked about this issue," he's talking now about the people who criticized him, "some of the people who talk about this issue discuss it from a religious point of view." Al-Louni asked, "What is their proof?" Bin Laden answered, they say that the killing of innocents is wrong and invalid, and for proof, they say that the Prophet forbade the killing of children and women. And that is true. It is valid and has been laid down by the Prophet in an authentic tradition. Aluni responded, "This is precisely what I'm talking about. This is exactly what I'm asking you about." Bin Laden replied, "But the forbidding of killing children and innocents is not set in stone." And there are other writings that uphold it. Bin Laden proceeded to quote the Quranic injunction, "If you believers respond to an attack, make your response proportionate." Actually, the passage continues. It reads, "But it is best to stand fast. So Prophet, be steadfast. Your steadfastness comes only from God. Do not grieve over them. Do not be distressed by their scheming, for God is with those who are mindful of Him and do good." According to most of the well-known commentaries on the Quran, this passage was revealed after the Meccan polytheist had killed and mutilated many Muslims, including the Prophet's beloved uncle Hamza, in the Battle of Uhud. In a moment of anger, the Prophet is said to have made an oath to kill and mutilate many of the polytheists. Some of his followers made similar oaths. It was in response to such oaths that this passage was reportedly revealed. It was intended both to limit any possible retaliation so that it would be proportionate, and to encourage the Prophet to be patient so that he would refrain from revenge altogether. Indeed, the Prophet subsequently atoned for his oath and even forgave Hamza's killer. In any case, Bin Laden continued, "The scholars and people of knowledge, among them Sahib al-Ikhtiyarat, this is Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn al-Qayyim, and al-Shawkani, and many others, and Al-Qurtubi, may God bless him in his Quran commentary, say that if the disbelievers were to kill our children and women, then we should not feel ashamed to do the same to them, mainly to deter them from trying to kill our children and women again." The reality, however, is that while various scholars legitimized, in cases of necessity, darura, the use of certain destructive methods in response to an enemy's use of such methods, they generally did not condone the intentional killing of innocents as a means of retaliation. In fact, the Quran commentator Bin Laden invoked to justify this practice, Al-Qurtubi, explicitly rejected it in his exegetical writings. He stated that even if enemy forces killed our women and children and made us grieve on account of this, then it is still not permissible for us to kill them intentionally in a similar manner to cause them to grieve and be sad. This statement comes from Al-Qurtubi's commentary on the Quranic directive, "Do not let hatred of others lead you away from justice, but adhere to justice, for that is closer to awareness of God." Surah 5, verse 8. The available writings of the other scholars invoked by Bin Laden reveal no obvious departure from Al-Qurtubi on this matter. Now, there's a lot more one could say about Bin Laden's various ostensibly contradictory justifications for the 9/11 attacks. Suffice it to say that he was by no means a strict literalist. Of course, the same could be said about Muslims in general. And yet, it is critical to recognize that the attempts of Al-Qaeda and ISIS to justify terrorism on Islamic grounds typically require the abandonment of both strict literalism and the historically prevailing interpretations of Islamic thought. The interpretations of such radicals, such violent radicals, are hardly straightforward. They are their own thing. But now, we cannot simply leave it at that. We must ask the larger question: what motivated the 9/11 hijackers to kill thousands of civilians and themselves? How can we explain the various acts of self-sacrificial terrorism committed by ISIS members and other Muslims? Various prominent new atheist authors explain such phenomena by pointing to Islam, not idiosyncratic interpretations of the religion, but the core of the religion itself, and downplaying other factors. While the worldwide Muslim scholarly and clerical condemnations of Muslim terrorism suggest that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other violent radicals are on the fringes of the jihad tradition, Harris places them firmly in the center. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali, suggests that such radicals are not, in fact, a lunatic fringe of extremists. As Richard Dawkins sees it, the matter is fairly simple. Suicide bombers do what they do because they really believe what they were taught in their religious schools, that duty to God exceeds all other priorities, and that martyrdom in his service will be rewarded in the gardens of paradise. Now, compare such assessments with the more incisive analysis offered by terrorism specialist Jessica Stern. Based on her research, Professor Stern finds that terrorists are typically motivated by multiple factors, and that terrorist movements often arise in reaction to an injustice, real or imagined, that they feel must be corrected. Terrorism, she adds, spreads in part through bad ideas. The most dangerous and seductive bad idea spreading around the globe today is a distorted and destructive interpretation of Islam, which asserts that killing innocents is a way to worship God. Part of the solution must come from within Islam and Islamic scholars, who can refute this ideology with arguments based on theology and ethics. But bad ideas are only part of the problem. Terrorists prey on vulnerable populations, people who feel humiliated or victimized, or who find their identities by joining extremist movements. And of course, we can have a long discussion about how it got to this point. Professor Stern goes on to offer suggestions for how to strengthen such vulnerable populations. Now, there can be little doubt that religious faith is indeed a critical motivating factor for many, not all, but for many Muslim terrorists. But their Islam is distinct in important ways from the broader and historical Islamic traditions. I can understand why, as a journalist, Graham Wood of The Atlantic would characterize ISIS members as being Islamic. They identify as such, and they invoke Islamic traditions. What is problematic is the added emphasis, very Islamic. Now I'd like to return to Sam Harris. Less than a month before his aforementioned interview with Fareed Zakaria, Harris had appeared on Real Time with Bill Maher. In the midst of a heated exchange with actor Ben Affleck on the subject of Islam, Harris, having stated that he was actually well educated on the topic, proclaimed, "We have to be able to criticize bad ideas, and Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas." He proceeded to claim that suicide bombers occupy the center of Muslim communities. He added, "We're misled to think that the fundamentalists are the fringe," to which host Bill Maher chimed in, "That's the key point." The Islam that Harris portrays in his writings does indeed appear to be a mother lode of bad ideas. But it is an Islam that the vast majority of Muslims, whether scholars or lay people, would likely not recognize, a mother lode of bad analysis. It is even more extreme in some ways than bin Laden's Islam. This is because Harris draws a nearly straight line from the Islamic tradition to 9/11. He erroneously downplays the significance of non-religious factors when assessing the Al-Qaeda leader, asserting that bin Laden's grievances were purely theological. Bin Laden's Islam, however, was not that simple. His views on jihad were formed through convoluted reasoning and guided by a warped perception of geopolitical reality. Notwithstanding their profound differences, the same is generally true for ISIS. As such, Zakaria missed the mark when he told Harris that the problem was that he, Harris, was in agreement with Osama bin Laden's interpretation of Islam. Although bin Laden and Harris both envisioned a civilizational clash, Harris's interpretation of Islam is so aberrant, so extreme, that it cannot even be ascribed to the man behind 9/11. I told you all this was a dark project. Thank you all for listening.